Russia border. It was the brainchild of the Blair government, a custodial sentence labelled indeterminate. Now, the idea was to ensure that criminals stayed behind bars until they were certain not to reoffend. A fine theory. In practice, it meant some people were sent to prison for relatively minor offences and never released. The policy has now been abolished, but as Zoe Conway has discovered for Newsnight, the backlog is so great that some 5,500 people are still languishing in prison with no release date.
Every few months, Wendy Huxley makes this journey from her home in Ellesmere Port near Liverpool to see her son Richard, who's in prison in Lancashire.
Brilliant, folks, thank you.
When he was 18, Richard was given a 17-month minimum sentence for assault and attempted robbery. 8 years later, he's still in prison.
You know, he's lost so many years of his life. It's silly. It's wrong that they're in there and forgotten about, basically.
Richard is serving what's known as an indeterminate sentence for public protection, or an IPP, which means that throughout his time in prison, he's never been given a release date. In order to get released, IPP prisoners must prove to a parole board that they're no longer a danger to the public. If they're unsuccessful, they could wait 2 years before they get another hearing. In Richard's case, he hasn't always been perfect. 3 years ago, he failed a drugs test. But his family and his lawyers argue that in 8 years, he's never been violent. So why is he still in this prison? David Blunkett introduced IPPs 10 years ago when he was Home Secretary. They were meant to be applied to serious violent and sexual offences.
People are being let out of prison when everybody concerned knows that this is going to happen again.
He had in mind people like Roy Whiting, who murdered 8-year-old Sarah Payne. He'd been in prison before for a serious sexual crime. The government estimated that IPPs would be given to 900 offenders, but it was applied far more widely. By 2012, there were 6,000 IPP prisoners.
See my wing, I would stand in our window whenever I was out on a wing and just watch freedom.
Sean Lloyd was released from prison 3 weeks ago. He spent some of his sentence at Cardiff Prison, just a few hundred yards from where he grew up. At the age of 18, he was given a tariff of 2 years and 9 months after committing 2 street robberies. He ended up serving more than 8 years.
Do you think you deserve to go to prison?
Yeah, I think I deserve to go to prison, obviously, but not for the length of time that I've done, because it's messed me up, like.
So is that all the stuff from your cell?
Yep, everything.
Like all IPP prisoners, Sean was required to take offender behaviour courses to prove to the parole board that he was no longer a risk. The problem is they're in short supply, and prisoners can wait months to get on them.
As an IPP prisoner with no release date, 7 years over tariff, my head was battered, like my head was gone, I was suicidal.
Donna Ridgely comes to this graveyard in Surrey every week so that she can feel close to her brother Sean, who committed suicide after 3 years in prison. He had serious mental health problems and was a recovering drug addict. He'd been given an IPP sentence of 2 years and 5 months for forcing someone to take money out of a cash machine. Donna was the last person to speak to him alive.
He rang me in the morning and he just said that, you know, I love you all and that look after my mum. I just can't take no more, Donna. I don't know what's happening with my life, but I just can't take no more. And that was it. He just said, love you and bye.
Sean had been told he needed to do a drug rehabilitation course and transferred to another prison to do it, but the course wasn't available. It was this, Donna says, that tipped him over the edge.
For people like Sean that are very vulnerable, not having that deadline of saying, okay, I know Sean done bad things, I know people in prison do bad things, but if he had a date when he could have been coming out, I think he would have still lived with a little bit of hope.
Mr. Secretary Clark.
The IPP sentence was abolished by the then Justice Secretary Ken Clarke 2 years ago. He called it a stain on the criminal justice system. But it was not retrospective. There remains within the system 5,500 IPP prisoners. Nearly 2/3 are over tariff. At the current release rate, it will take 9 years to clear the backlog of over tariff prisoners. We told the former Home Secretary David Blunkett about Wendy's son Richard and his 8 years in prison.
I'd say that this is an injustice. I would say that the original intention had nothing to do with circumstances where people would be held way beyond the normal tariff in a situation where in some instances they've not been able to take the necessary course and demonstrate the rehabilitation necessary, the change in their behaviour.
In terms of the families that are watching, what would you say to them about your role in this?
Well, I would say that I implemented what I believed was necessary to safeguard the public.
But you got it wrong.
And I regret very much that we were not clearer in terms of the criteria laid down, tougher in terms of saying what the judges should or should not do, and we were not effective enough in putting in the necessary resources to ensure that the rehabilitation courses were available.
So you got it wrong?
Well, we certainly got the implementation wrong, but the intention was, in my view, correct.
Wendy has just finished a 2-hour visit with her son Richard. They talked about his next parole hearing, which is in 2 weeks' time.
He's anxious, really. Just wants it over and done with, I think, to find out what's happening either way. He doesn't want to build his hopes up too high in case he gets another knockback. You know, God, for someone that's only doing an 18-month sentence, he's done a heck of a long time.
If Richard is moved to an open prison, he's likely to stay there for a year to 18 months, which means he'll have spent 10 years inside.
Well, that was Zoe Conway, and I'm joined now by Crispin Blunt, who was Prisons Minister under Ken Clarke and worked with him to abolish these indeterminate sentences. And Crispin Blunt, you abolished these. I wonder what you hear when you see those stories.
When I look at that, I know we did precisely the right thing. These sentences were both unjust and stupid, because the effect was, as we heard from David Blunkett, they were not administered properly. So the system, there were 6,500 of these prisoners in prison when I became the Prisons Minister, with 3,000 beyond tariff. And the parole board were releasing 1 in 20 of those who applied for release. So the system was simply filling up. And there was a stage in this process where we were going to end up with 25,000 of these people in our prison system if something hadn't been done. It began to be addressed in 2008. And I'm delighted to say we managed to get it abolished at the first attempt, first piece of legislation in 2012.
But when you hear how big the backlog is, and Zoe was reporting that it would take 9 years at the current rate to clear this, what do you think the government should do?
Well, it will accelerate. So the first application to the parole board, with a very defensive parole board that had been shouted at by John Ree when he was Home Secretary, they were releasing too many people, so their reaction was to become very defensive and not release many people and not make sensible judgments about when people should be released. So you had a very low release rate. All of these things begin to get addressed as people do more programmes and get themselves to a place where the parole board can have more confidence they're going to be released. And also, certainly under Ken Clarke and I, that I think the parole board would have had more confidence that they were going to get supported by ministers in taking sensible decisions, and I believe that will still be the case.
We had a statement from the government tonight which says the release of prisoners serving indeterminate sentences entirely a matter for the parole board. We have no intention of retrospectively altering lawfully imposed IPP sentences. Is that the right response?
Well, the normal, when you change sentences, you do not normally make it retrospective. So sentencing regimes exist at the time you're sentenced, and so there are people who are under particular release programs because that was the law when they were sentenced, and that's the general principle that underlies.
You say general, but could that have been done
sentencing.
retrospectively?
I suppose it could have done. I don't think there would have been collective agreement to do it. But how I wanted to address that was making absolutely crystal clear to the National Offender Management Service that every day someone spent in prison beyond their tariff when they hadn't completed the appropriate programs was then a self-inflicted injury. It meant that we were keeping them in prison at taxpayers' expense longer than they needed to be, without them putting them in the best place to make the best presentation to the parole.
And we've seen very clearly what it's done to some families, completely destroyed them. What would be your message to Chris Grayling tonight, given the numbers, the vast numbers that are outstanding still and on indeterminate sentences?
The numbers have dropped by 1,000 in terms of those who are beyond tariff since I was left being Prisons Minister in September 2012. So there has continued to be progress here, and so that gradually, and because now the tap has been turned off because the sentences are no longer being imposed, that allows the system to focus more resources in terms of their sentence planning to make sure that they complete their programs whilst they're doing their punishment tariff, and therefore they can have a better chance of being released at the first application to the parole board.
But that can't be sped up. I mean, there are some people who, you know, you heard from Sean, who was in there for 8 years on a sentence that was fewer than 3 to begin with. I mean,
I mean, I entirely agree with you. That's why.
But there must be plenty more like that. You must be thinking we can seriously accelerate this.
Well, that's certainly the point I was putting rather strongly to the senior officials of the National Offender Management Service, is that they had to focus resources in this area, and I was having reports made regularly to me about the progress that we were making and making sure that resources were being properly focused. Because if people weren't getting to the parole board having at least had the chance to complete their programs and address their offending behaviour, then it was both unjust and administratively stupid.
Crispin Blunt, thank you very much. Thanks.